In 2025, a nation deliberately wrote its own suicide note and hand-delivered it to a neighbor who finally decided to stop playing nice. After all, what do you expect when you poke a sleeping giant for decades, assuming they will never wake up? You get completely and utterly crushed, that's what. For years, the geopolitical dynamic between India and Pakistan followed a predictable, almost exhausting routine. Pakistan would fund a terror attack. India would express deep outrage on the global stage. The international community would ask for restraint, and everyone would go back to business as usual. In April 2025, Pakistan did something so horrific, so fundamentally insane, that it had gotten ridiculous. They pushed India into a corner, and in response, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi bypassed standard military strikes entirely. He went straight for the jugular and weaponized the very rivers that keep Pakistan alive. This is the chaotic, brutal story of the 2025 Pahalgam massacre, the fiery vengeance of Operation Sindoor, and the exact moment Pakistan became a global laughingstock by trying to fight a modern war with fake social media posts. Strap in, because the map of South Asia was redrawn in exactly 18 days. To understand the sheer scale of India's retaliation, we have to look at the trigger. It was the 22nd of April, 2025. Bizaran Valley, located near Pahalgam in Jammu and Kashmir, is often called the mini Switzerland of India. It is a place of breathtaking beauty, thick pine forests, and usually hundreds of tourists looking for a peaceful escape. On this Tuesday, the peace was shattered by automatic gunfire. 3 heavily armed Islamist terrorists, backed and trained by launch pads across the border, infiltrated the valley. Now, this was a highly calculated, targeted massacre. Survivor accounts had revealed a chilling detail. The attackers stopped people, demanded their identification, questioned them about their religion, and systematically executed anyone identified as a Hindu. 26 innocent civilians were murdered in cold blood. The images that flooded Indian news channels that evening were devastating. Bodies were lying amidst the pristine green landscapes. Families were torn apart. The sheer brutality of the point-blank executions sent a shockwave of absolute fury across the nation. Over in Islamabad, the political and military elite likely expected the usual routine. They expected the Indian Ministry of External Affairs to issue a strongly worded dossier. They expected the United Nations to urge calm. They assumed they had once again bled India with 1,000 cuts and gotten away with it. Only thing is, this time, they were dead wrong. The mood in New Delhi was unrecognizable. The political patience, or whatever was left of it, had completely evaporated. The Indian government adopted a terrifying silence. Behind closed doors, a two-pronged strategy was being drafted to completely paralyze the neighbor. The first move was entirely silent. If you want to destroy a nation, you don't always need bombs and ammunition. Sometimes you just need to turn off the tap. On the 23rd of April, barely 24 hours after the massacre, the Indian government dropped a crazy nuke. They announced the suspension of the Indus Water Treaty. To grasp the magnitude of this decision, you need to understand what the Indus Water Treaty actually is. Signed in 1960, it is a water distribution agreement brokered by the World Bank. It gave India control over the 3 eastern rivers, the Bays, Ravi, and Sutlej, while giving Pakistan control over the 3 massive western rivers, the Indus, Chenab, and Jhelum. Practically speaking, this meant India graciously allowed roughly 80% of the water in the Indus system to flow directly into Pakistan. This water is as good as the lifeblood of Pakistan's agriculture, economy, and survival. Without it, their crops die, their power grids fail, and their entire economy collapses. For 65 years, through 3 major wars and countless border skirmishes, India never touched this treaty, which is actually pretty merciful. There was this unspoken rule that water was too sacred and too crucial to human life to be used as a weapon of war. However, Modi's government looked at the 26 bodies in Pahalgam and decided the old rules were dead in the water. Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri stood before the press and delivered the fatal blow. The Indus Water Treaty was placed in abeyance with immediate effect. The message was crystal clear. Blood and water cannot flow together. So until Pakistan irrevocably destroyed its terror infrastructure, India would squeeze their water supply. Panic erupted in Islamabad. The Pakistani leadership suddenly realized they had grossly miscalculated. They were staring down the barrel of an absolute catastrophe. By legally pausing the treaty under the Vienna Convention rules, citing national security, India threatened to build rapid storage and diversion infrastructure on the western rivers. They were legally preparing to dry out their enemy. The craziest part is that India was far from done. The diplomatic chokehold was only phase 1. Phase 2 was going to be loud, violent, and very devastating. On the night of May 7, 2025, the skies over the line of control roared to life. This was the beginning of Operation Sindoor. India abandoned the idea of a quick, secretive surgical strike. They decided to send a message that could be seen from space. A massive, coordinated military campaign was launched, involving advanced missile strikes, heavy artillery, and precision aerial bombardments. The primary targets were the deeply entrenched terror infrastructure in Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, alongside high-value targets deep inside Pakistan itself. Indian forces systematically obliterated 9 major terror launch pads belonging to Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and Hizbul Mujahideen. These were the exact facilities that had trained and armed the Pahalgam attackers. The Indian armed forces went even further. To ensure complete air dominance and to blind the enemy, they targeted and destroyed critical Pakistani military radar installations in Lahore and Gujranwala. Indian missiles were actively destroying military infrastructure deep inside major Pakistani cities, and the Pakistani military was essentially powerless to stop it. Over 100 terrorists were killed in the initial waves of the operation. The sheer kinetic force of the strikes left the Pakistani High Command in a state of sheer panic. For years, Pakistan had hidden behind its nuclear arsenal, bluffing the world into believing that any Indian attack would result in a nuclear war. Operation Sindoor called out that bluff with dominance. India proved they could carry out a high-intensity, multi-day war, dismantle Pakistani military assets, and Islamabad could not dare touch their nuclear button because of the fear of being wiped off the map entirely. The Pakistani military scrambled to mount a counter-offensive. They launched jets, deployed desperate drone attacks, and initiated heavy cross-border shelling. They were vastly outgunned, outmaneuvered, and completely outclassed by a modernized Indian military apparatus which was heavily prepared for a long, grinding war. Now, when you are losing a war on the ground, you can only try to win it on the internet. This is exactly where the story shifts from a political thriller to an absolute comedy of errors. Desperate to save face before their own citizens, the Pakistani military establishment launched a massive disinformation campaign. The goal was to convince the Pakistani public that their brave armed forces were repelling the Indian attacks and inflicting heavy casualties. They executed this in the most embarrassing way imaginable. Pakistani state authorities and major political accounts began sharing video clips on social media, claiming they showed Pakistani fighter jets shooting down Indian aircrafts. The videos went viral almost instantly. Thousands of Pakistani users cheered, believing they were witnessing a glorious victory. There was one massive problem, though. The footage was entirely fabricated. These weren't even sophisticated deepfakes. The Pakistani authorities literally grabbed gameplay footage from the military simulator video game Arma 3, slapped a grainy filter on it, and presented it to the world as real combat footage. This is not a joke at all. A nuclear nation's defense establishment tried to prove its military competence by posting video game clips on Twitter. The humiliation kept compounding for them. They circulated images of supposedly destroyed Indian tanks and captured soldiers. But within hours, independent fact-checkers and open-source intelligence accounts completely dismantled these claims. The destroyed Indian tanks were actually photos from the Syrian civil war taken half a decade ago. What's worse is that the captured soldiers were actors from old training exercises. The global community could only watch in stunned amusement. Foreign diplomats and military analysts openly mocked the blatant incompetence on display. Pakistan was bleeding on the battlefield, completely paralyzed by the suspension of the water treaty, and was actively turning itself into a meme on the global stage. They tried to fight a 21st century information war with the tactics of a cheap internet troll farm, and it backfired spectacularly. The ultimate checkmate. While Pakistan was busy playing video games, India dealt the final, crushing blow. They ignored the social media circus. They went straight to the press room and released the satellite imagery. The Indian Ministry of Defense declassified high-resolution before and after satellite photographs of the targets that were hit during Operation Sindoor, and they were undeniable. Where robust terror training camps had stood just days prior, there were now only smoking craters. The radar installations in Lahore and Gujranwala were also shown to be completely flattened. The evidence was presented to the international community, leaving absolutely zero room for Pakistani denial. The contrast was staggering. On one side, a nation was posting fake video game clips to social media. On the other side, a rising global superpower calmly presented irrefutable satellite proof of a flawlessly executed military operation. By the 10th of May, the Pakistani military command reached its breaking point. Their terror proxies were dead, their radars were smashed, and their economy was tanking. The Pakistani Director General of Military Operations picked up the secure line and called his Indian counterpart to ask for a ceasefire. India agreed, but entirely on its own strict terms. Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh later took to the podium and made it brutally clear that on Pakistan's begging, India halted Operation Sindoor voluntarily from a position of absolute dominance with their ammunition stockpiles barely dented. They possessed the surge capacity to maintain the war for months, but they had already achieved their objectives. The new reality of South Asia. The events of April and May 2025 fundamentally altered the reality of the Indian subcontinent. For decades, Pakistan relied on the assumption that India was a soft state, constrained by international pressure and an obsession with taking the moral high ground. They assumed the Indus Water Treaty was untouchable and that their nuclear bluff gave them a permanent shield. Narendra Modi's government took every single one of those assumptions and set them on fire. Operation Sindoor proved that India is willing to cross borders and destroy military infrastructure to protect its citizens. The abeyance of the Indus Water Treaty proved that India is willing to leverage every single geographical and economic advantage it holds to crush state-sponsored terrorism. Pakistan finds itself entirely embarrassed today. They are staring at a future where their very water security is dependent on whether or not they can control the radical elements they spent decades cultivating. They learned the hardest possible lesson: you cannot wage a proxy war against an economic and military powerhouse and expect them to hold back forever. The Pahalgam attack was designed to break India's spirit, but the strike awoke a ruthless, calculated machine that permanently rewrote the rules of engagement. India showed the world that they will no longer issue diplomatic complaints when they are attacked. They will turn off your water, dismantle your military, and force you to surrender while the whole world watches. Drop your thoughts on India's move to suspend the Indus Water Treaty down in the comments below. And if you want to dive deeper into the insane world of geopolitics and global power struggles, make sure subscribe to Affluent Aces. Until next time then.